Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Miranda again. I'm going to teach today's lesson on point of view in informational text. So before we get on with the lesson, please take out your writer's notebook and a pencil to take down notes. And yeah, just pause the video if you haven't done that already. But today's text, we're going to be looking at an excerpt from Ronald Takaki's book, A Different Mirror for Young People. But yeah, that's the text we're going to look at. But before we get into that, we're going to go over a few things so we can better understand it. And also, the point of the lesson is to talk about point of view, right? Okay, so by the end of the lesson, I hope you guys will be able to tell yourselves, I can point out the author's point of view and purpose, and I can determine how they distinguish their viewpoints from that of others. So before we continue, I just want to talk about a little bit about history, because this is going to pertain to the text we're going to read later. So before the 1840s, did you know that a lot of the Southwest was considered part of Mexico? And so this is the Southwest here down the bottom. So you see here, Arizona, like our own state, and around here in blue, this all used to be part of Mexico. I think also Kansas might have been part of Mexico, but I'm not too sure. But yeah, this whole thing used to be part of Mexico. And also, most of the Mexicans and Mexican Americans aren't of just one race. We're a mix of a whole bunch of different races. That it's just hard to keep track of. But back then, people used to refer to us Mexicans or Mexican Americans as mestizos, which is just a term to describe people of mixed races and those people from Mexico of mixed races. And those races that were mixed together were the indigenous groups of Mexico. So not just so this used to be Mexico. So some of the indigenous groups here a little bit, but mostly the indigenous groups in where Mexico is today. The indigenous groups, the main ones that we hear about are Mayan and Aztec, but there are other tribes also in Mexico. Also, that race got mixed in with the European race, specifically people from Spain, because of the Spanish conquistadors. When they came, they had kids with people of indigenous ancestry. And also, something that at least I always forget is that there are some Afro-Latinos or people that are mixed with African ancestry. Not all of us. So when we say mestizos, like people from Mexico that are mixed race, that doesn't mean every single Mexican has indigenous blood, European blood, or African blood. It might just be indigenous and European and African, or sometimes all of these three. Mexico is just one big, huge melting pot. And yeah, so if you ever wondered why there isn't Mexican on a ballot or on something when saying, oh, what race are you? It's because most Latinos and Mexicans are a lot of different races mixed together. And also Mexican isn't a race, it's a nationality, kind of like American. American is a nationality. People from America are called Americans. People from Mexico are called Mexicans. That's a nationality. Nationality is different from race and ethnicity. Okay. And also, if you wondered how are Mexicans or mestizos mixed in with African blood? Well, if you remember from maybe your elementary school when we talked about the slave trade, or we learned about the slave trade in elementary school, and the slave trade didn't just include the United States; it included all of the Americas, and a lot of the stopping points were around Mexico. So over time, Mexico got rid of slavery, and then also it was starting to be more okay to have kids with people of African descent. So that's why there's a mix of indigenous, Spanish, and African. And also, here's Mexico. Okay, so I just want you guys to think about a few things about yourself. So how did you and or your biological family get here? So for me, my parents came from Mexico. So I'm the first generation of our family to be born in the United States. So that's how my family got here. But as far as how did my family come from Mexico or get to Mexico, I do not know. Again, we're all, not all of us, but a lot of Mexican Americans are mixed race, of indigenous, Black, and Spanish or European. So a lot of different places. I don't know that far deep. But if you don't know where your family or how your family got to the Americas or how they got to the United States, ask them. Ask your parents or guardians. They might know. Also, the next question I want you guys to discuss with people around you, if you have people around you, is where um, where all your families, where all your ancestors from a different continent, or did some immigrate? So again, that kind of tied into the first question. Yeah, my parents immigrated to the United States. Maybe yours did too, for different reasons, maybe for the same reasons. But yeah, there's something to think about. Okay, so not to the actual lesson. If you watched the previous video on point of view in literature text, we talked about point of view, but here we're just going to go through it quickly. So if you remember, first person is when the author tells a story from their vantage point, and they tell the reader or listener the story or the text of what they're experiencing themselves, or from what they're seeing. And they're usually using words like I, me, my, we, us, or our. Second person, the narrator is including you in the story, and they use words like you and yours to do that. Third person, the author tells a story or writes the text from an observer's vantage point. So they're like watching everything, but they don't include their own thoughts and feelings usually. But they might know the thoughts and feelings of one or more people involved in the text. And they use words like he, she, they, or them. And then, so here are the subcategories within first person, if you don't remember. So you can have first person limited, where the narrator only knows their own thoughts and feelings, but they're telling you their story from their own perspective or their own point of view. And then first person omniscient, the narrator knows the thoughts and feelings of everybody. So they might be mind readers. You don't really see this in informational text, but in literature text, sometimes the character knows everyone's thoughts, but not really in informational text unless you have superpowers. And so for third person, we have third person limited, where the narrator only knows the thoughts and feelings of one person in the text. You might run into this in informational, but definitely in literature. Also, third person omniscient, the narrator knows the thoughts and feelings of all the individuals in the text. And then third person objective, the narrator doesn't know or doesn't use the thoughts or feelings of anyone involved in the text, just to stay unbiased. So this is what we're going to usually see in informational text when it's someone's writing about something that happened and they weren't actually there. So a lot of times they just write what they observed, and they can't read people's minds. No one can read people's minds. They can only make inferences. But yeah, that's third person objective. And if you need to take down the notes and because you didn't have these from the last video, feel free to rewind the video to go back and write these notes down, and pause this video here if you need to take this slide down, and continue the video when you're ready. So again, we went over this in the last video. Why is point of view important to understand? Well, it helps us to set the tone. Is it something? Are we reading something that's sad? Is it happy, or is it like indifferent? Is it just, it can be either. But point of view also helps us understand the overall message that the author or narrator is trying to tell us or learn, or what they're trying to make us learn from the text. And then the narrator also has their own perspective. Unless it's third person objective, it will show. So what I mean by that is, if they were there, they're gonna probably write in first person limited, because they only know their own thoughts and feelings, and they're only writing about what they're feeling. So however they experienced something happening to them, that's how they're going to write it, and you're going to understand it through their perspective. But if it's in third person objective, they're just going to stay out of it and just state some things like quotes and observations, and just let you decide what to do with that information. And the point of view will influence the reader's thoughts and opinions on other individuals and events in the text. So depending on who is telling the story or writing the text, that might influence your opinion on certain things. So let's say we were reading about slavery, and we have a source that's written in first person limited, and the person writing it is a slave. So you're going to understand what happened in that time through the eyes of a slave. But if we were reading the text of a slave owner and in their first person limited point of view, we're going to see what they thought about that time or that subject. And we're going to think two different things. We're going to see two different ideas and opinions, depending on who's writing the text. So things to keep in mind before we read. I want you guys to keep this in your mind, or even write this down in your notes, so you don't have to like memorize these questions. But when you're reading, we should ask ourselves, do we know who the narrator is? If so, who is it? If not, explain why you don't know. What is the narrator's point of view? So again, first person, third person. And if you want to get specific, it can be limited, omniscient, or objective. And then whose thoughts and feelings is the narrator aware of? Are they only aware of their own and they're just putting out quotes, or do they know everyone's thoughts and feelings? Who is mainly in the text? So who are involved, or characters? You can say characters in the text. So who are individuals? Since we're reading informational, we're going to read about actual people. So who's in the text? And then what is the text about? So what is the issue? What's the event? We're reading an informational text today, so there's going to be an event. Okay, so like I shared before in the beginning of the video, we're going to read from this book, A Different Mirror for Young People, A History of Multicultural America by Ronald Takaki. And before we get on, what do you think this book is about? Just give it a few seconds to think about. So here we have we have the word multicultural. So this book is titled, part of the title is A History of Multicultural America. So what do we think the book is going to be about based on that phrase? Well, multicultural means having more than one cultural or ethnic group in a community or society. So this book is probably about the different types of cultures in America and probably how they got there. And a different mirror probably means that we're going to see different things that we usually don't learn about in school, and it's going to be told in a different way. So yeah. So again, keep these questions in mind. Okay, so the chapter we're going to read an excerpt from, or a passage from. We're not going to read the whole chapter. We're just going to read a little bit of it. It's called The War Against Mexico, and this is the 7th chapter in the book. So just off of that alone, what do you think this chapter is about? Okay, I just think it's going to be about how America got into conflict with Mexico. This chapter is probably about how that happened. And then we have this this subtitle here called the troubled region called Tejas. Tejas is just what what Mexico calls Texas, because they named Texas. It was originally called Tejas, and it used to be spelled this way. So yeah, so maybe this part of the text is going to be just about how there was issues in Texas, and how Mexico, and you know how Mexico used to own like all of Texas, including other states that are part of the United States today. And so we're probably going to learn about that. And then a word I want you guys to keep in mind is diversity. It's a range of different things. So if we're talking about cultural diversity, we're probably talking about a range of different cultures. And here's just pictures of the United States flag. Here's the Texas flag for today. And this is the Mexican flag. Okay, so let's get to reading. So, the war against Mexico. While Irish women worked in textile mills of Massachusetts and Irishmen fully built roads and railway tracks, America's frontier moved westward. The United States grew larger by acquiring territory from the nations by purchase, treaty, or force. In the 1840s, the Mexican-American War gave Irish immigrant men another job to do for the United States, serving as soldiers in a conflict with the neighboring nation of Mexico. That war greatly enlarged the American empire by adding California and the Southwest to the United States. It also added another ethnic group to American diversity, Mexicans. The troubled region called Tejas. Before we continue, the sentence looks like it's going to be cut off, so I'm just going to read what we have here. So the first conflicts between the United States and Mexico took place in a territory called, and when we continue, it's going to say Texas. And then again, if you don't know where Texas is, we're here in Arizona. It's just 2 states over, and this is Texas. Phoenix is the capital of Arizona. Austin is the capital of Texas today. So that's where Texas is. Okay, so we have here the first question that, remember, we're trying to keep track of. Do we know the narrator, or who the narrator is? If so, who is it? If not, explain why you think so. I'm going to answer this one for you. It's the author is Ronald Takaki. He's the narrator. He's the one that wrote this book. There was no indication in the text back here that we were reading through the perspective of someone else. Like, there was no words like I or me or my. So yeah, there was no indication that it was a different person narrating the story. So, and with that information, what's the narrator's point of view? And since we just looked at how there's no words like I, me, my, we, or our, or you, or yours, what point of view would this be in? Would this be written in? Well, it's in third person. And it's Ronald Takaki is writing about what happened with Mexico and the United States back then. But he wasn't there, so he's going to be writing this in third person, and he's trying to be objective. So he can't read the minds of people, especially people that don't exist today. He can't read the minds of people that are dead. All right, so the next question, whose thoughts and feelings is the narrator aware of? Again, we didn't read too much into the text yet, but it doesn't look like he can read anyone's mind, because he wasn't there either. Like he can't read people's minds in general, like nobody can, but still he wasn't there, so he doesn't really know what people thought or felt, because no one told him directly. All he can do is look at history. So we're going to say he's not aware of anyone's, so no one's thoughts and feelings. So who is mainly in the text so far? We're just going to say Irish immigrants, Americans, and Mexicans. Because remember back here, it says while Irish women worked in textiles, also Irish men built railroads, and also, where does it say? The Mexican-American War gave Irish immigrant men another job for the United States, serving as soldiers in conflict with the neighboring nation of Mexico. So we know that Irish immigrants and Americans in general were involved in a conflict with Mexico. So we can say, and also down here it says a different ethnic group was added to American diversity, Mexicans. So we can say here that Irish immigrants and Americans and Mexicans were involved. And the Irish immigrants were considered Americans at the time, some of them. And we don't know this. We know a little bit about what the text is about, but we didn't read the whole thing. So we want to be able to answer the question fully. So we're going to read the rest of the text before we answer that one. The first conflicts between the United States and Mexico took place in a Mexican territory called Tejas, or as it is known today, Texas. Although Texas was part of Mexico, Americans began crossing the Mexican border to settle there in the 1820s. Many were slaveholders from the South in search of new lands on which to grow cotton. In 1826, President Quincy Adams tried to buy Texas for $1 million, but Mexico refused. A year later, worried about U.S. expansion westward, the Mexican government investigated the situation in Texas. It found a growing number of Americans living there, breaking Mexican laws and taking possession of land without permission from the authorities. When visiting the American settlement at Austin, a Mexican lieutenant, Jose Maria Sanchez, predicted, in my judgment, the spark that will start the conflagration that will deprive us, Texas, will start from this colony. To stem the tide of Americans, in 1830, the Mexican government outlawed slavery and banned any more American immigration into Texas. American foreigners in Texas were furious. Many were determined to defy Mexico's anti-slavery law at the time. More Americans crossed the border into Mexico as illegal aliens. By 1835, there were 20,000 Americans in Texas, greatly outnumbering the 4,000 Mexicans. So if you didn't know what immigration, conflagration, or deprive was, immigration is just the action of moving from one place to live in another permanently. So my parents did that. They immigrated from Mexico to the United States to live here permanently. Conflagration, it's just a way of saying a big fire that destroys a lot of land and property. And deprive means to deny the ability to use or to have something. So here, conflagration and deprive, we see these two words used by Jose Maria Sanchez when he predicted, in my judgment, the spark that will start the conflagration that will deprive of us Texas will start from this colony. So here, there's not a literal fire, because conflagration, that it means a fire, but he's using that word to describe the American colony that's not supposed to be there. He used that word to describe the colony in Austin, Texas. And that conflagration will deprive of us Texas will start from this colony. So eventually, because the Americans came into Texas illegally, but they're here we're saying they outnumber the Mexicans, so the American colonists or immigrants outnumber the Mexicans at this point. So Jose Maria Sanchez sees this and predicts that they'll deprive Mexico of that land because they're outnumbered. So that's what this part of the text says. Tensions grew. Stephen Austin, an American colonizer who had brought 300 families of settlers into Texas in the 1820s with the permission of the Mexican government, now urged his countrymen to Americanize Texas and bring the territory under the U.S. flag. He called for Americans to come to Texas, bringing rifles with them for conflict between the civilized white Americans and the mongrel Spanish, Indian, and Negro race of Mexico he believed was unavoidable. War is our only recourse, he declared. There is no other remedy. So this part is saying after like the whole colony, Austin, was settled, Mexico let them be there even though they weren't supposed to be there in the first place. Well, I shouldn't say that. Some American immigrants did come to into Mexican territory with permission, but others in Texas, a lot of them didn't. And in this case, they didn't. But eventually, Mexico didn't think that that was like something that they could help. So they're just like, okay, I guess they're here now. And later, Stephen Austin, the leader of that colony, later got actual permission to bring more. So first they didn't have permission, and now they had more. And now Stephen Austin here is saying, okay, we're going to try to Americanize this land here. And yeah, so that's what happened in this text. And civilized, you heard the word civilized and mongrel being used when Stephen Austin was talking. And civilized just means having advanced social and cultural development. And mongrel, it literally just means a dog, which you can't exactly say belongs to one breed or type. So here he's describing, okay, so let's read this sentence. He called for Americans to come to Texas bringing rifles with them for conflict between the civilized white Americans and the mongrel Spanish, Indian, and Negro race. So the author here is trying to like convey what Stephen Austin thought of the Mexicans here. So he thought that the white Americans were civilized, so they thought that they were more advanced than the Mexicans. And then the author uses a direct quote from Stephen Austin, which Stephen Austin said mongrel, Spanish, Indian, and Negro race to describe the Mexicans. So Stephen Austin is literally calling Mexicans dogs that have no particular one breed, so like mixed race. So it's just a mean way of calling someone mixed race, because he thinks people of one race are better than people that are mixed. That's pretty much what Stephen Austin is saying. So again, now that we've read all of this text and how we've talked about each section and how we've summarized each section of that text or that passage in that chapter, what is the text about? So just give it a moment to think about and write in your notebook to answer this in your own words. And I'll give you my thoughts in just a second. Okay. The text to me, based on what I read and explained, it's about how Americans both illegally immigrated and partially legally colonized Texas. So they illegally came into Texas, some of them, but then later they got actual permission to continue coming. So they were doing both. So it's about how Americans came to Texas, and also how Austin invited others to drive out Mexicans, even though Texas is, at this point, is still Mexican territory. So Stephen Austin was trying to claim Texas for the United States through force. Okay, so what just happened? So here we're just gonna restate like the questions in just a different way. We kind of already answered these. So who is the narrator again? It's Ronald Takaki, the author. What is the point of view? Where do you said this? It's in third person objective. Who are mainly in the story? Mexicans and Americans, and later Mexican Americans. So when Texas became part of the United States, some Mexicans stayed and they became Mexican American. But yeah, what is the topic? It's mostly about Mexican territory and the conflict because of the territory that the United States wanted, or some United States citizens wanted. And what is the setting? So if we go back to the text, we saw some dates or some years like 1820s, 1840s. So the setting was in North America in the 1800s. So we'll just say 1800s in general, like that whole century, because a lot happened in that century between Mexico and the United States. And I said North America because the borders kept changing at that time. And Mexico is part of North America. The United States is part of North America. And we didn't talk about Canada, but Canada is also part of North America. So those three countries are part of the North American continent. So remember how we talked about how this is written in third person objective? He wasn't actually there, and so all he can do is write about, all Ronald Takaki can do is write about what he knows about history, what he knows about certain historical figures, what they said. So he just presents us that information without saying, I thought or I felt this. So here, we don't see any words like I, me, my, we. He doesn't, in this, at least in this page, he doesn't say anything about his thoughts or feelings. Same thing with this section. He doesn't really say anything about his thoughts or feelings because, again, he wasn't there. How could he say his thoughts or feelings? All he could do is just look at the information, present it, and let the reader decide for themselves what they think and feel about it, even though we aren't there, or he wasn't there either. Here he doesn't really say, again, same thing, he doesn't really give his own input. The only time where I see he sort of did was when he made an inference about how Stephen Austin felt about Mexicans, was in this sentence, because yeah, he called for Americans to come to Texas bringing rifles with them for a conflict between the civilized white Americans and the mongrel Spanish, Indian, and Negro race. So this part, mongrel, Spanish, Indian, and Negro race, that's a direct quote from Stephen Austin. But based on that quote, Ronald Takaki made the inference that that Stephen Austin probably felt white Americans were more civilized than Mexicans. So that's the only time where he almost stated that he knew what Stephen Austin felt. But it's kind of hard to argue that he didn't, because that's what he said about Mexican Americans does make it seem that he put Mexican Americans below white civilized Americans. So you could argue that he did know what Stephen Austin felt, and he just wrote about it that way and without direct quotes. But he used a direct quote to understand what he felt. So you could either you could probably argue he did or didn't know what some individuals in the text felt. So here's what I wrote. The author / narrator's thoughts and feelings in this passage we read were not included. He only used descriptions of events and direct quotations from historical figures to reveal what they thought and felt. He wrote this in third-person objective and stayed as unbiased as he could. So yeah, the thoughts and feelings of Ronald Takaki weren't expressed, as far as I could tell. And hopefully you guys came up with something similar or were thinking the same thing. Okay, so the next question, instead of having you guys rewind to the text, because I know that can be a little hectic, I want you guys to read this quote from the passage. So this part is actually from what we just read. I just wanted to put it here so you don't have to rewind the video. So just read this and then answer the question underneath. After reading this quote, how do you think Mexicans felt about Americans in the 1800s? So again, we weren't there, so we're not gonna know. We can only make inferences based on the information that the author gave us when he wrote this text. So yeah, just infer what you think Mexicans felt about Americans in the 1800s. Yeah, so just pause the video and give it some time and continue to see what I think. So this is my answer to the question of how do you think Mexicans felt about Americans in the 1800s. So based off of what we read here, and how I would feel if I was living in that time. So a good way to think about this question is put yourselves in the shoes of Mexicans, so that you can feel what they felt. So how did they feel about the Americans in the 1800s? I said Mexicans, the Mexican government specifically, were probably scared of Americans. They were scared because Americans came to Mexico, the part now called Texas, and broke Mexican laws and took control of land without permission of Mexican authority. So yeah, I know that they were scared. Well, here in what we read, it says they were worried about U.S. expansion, and they gave a few reasons why. Because the growing number of Americans were breaking Mexican laws, taking possession of land without permission. So that's why I wrote what I wrote, based off of what we have here and from the passage that we read. That's how I got my answer and wrote it down here. So maybe you guys got something slightly different. Maybe you guys got some more of the same. But yeah, we're just trying to put ourselves in the shoes of Mexicans back then. So here, I want you guys to do the same thing, pretty much what we did in the last slide. I want you guys to read this excerpt from the passage we just read together. Again, this was actually in what we just read, and answer the question here. How do you think Americans, especially Stephen Austin, felt about the Mexicans in the 1800s? So just read this part of the text. And if you want to get more details, you can even rewind the video to see to see more information if you feel like there was more. But if you don't want to do that, you can just use the information provided here in this this portion. So just pause the video and write your answer down in your notebook, and continue the videos to see my answer. So here's my answer. So before I read my answer, I just looked at how Stephen Austin, he wanted his countrymen like fellow Americans, to help Americanize Texas, so that America can control Texas. That's what bringing the territory under U.S. flag. So if you put something under a flag, it means that you're giving control to the country of whoever owns that flag. He called for Americans to bring rifles for conflict between civilized white Americans and mongrel Spanish, Indian, and Negro race. So here, he thinks that Mexicans are less than human. He compared them to dogs that were mixed. So like, so yeah. And so this is my answer. Stephen Austin felt entitled to Texas because in his eyes, Mexicans were uncivilized mongrels. He invited Americans to bring rifles to help bring Texas under U.S. rule. And a lot of Americans did help him do that. We didn't continue. So the passage that we read in the chapter ended soon after, like one sentence after this, but they eventually did do that. So I just wanted you guys to use the information that we gave you in the text. But if you had the book with you, you would see that many Americans did feel the same way about Mexicans at that time. And even then, even if you look back to a different part of what we read together, you see that Americans took a lot of possessions without permission from authorities, from the Mexican authority. So they probably felt just as entitled as Stephen Austin to do that, to think that you can just take what you want from people who first owned something. But yeah, so that's the answer, or my answer for that. Maybe you got something similar or a little different. It's okay, just as long as you use the text to come up with your answer. So here we're just about done. We're doing the lesson recap now. So here's the first question that I want you guys to think about. Think about what we did with the text and our objective. Remember, our objective was so that we could understand like the point of view of the author and to see how that impacts the text. So that's exactly what the first question is. How does the narrator's or author's point of view impact the way information was presented? So just remember an example, what we just read. Ronald Takaki was writing in third person objective, so he's staying out of it. How did that impact the way that he presented the information? And just think about the different ways that, like, if it was written in first person limited, how would that impact the information? So yeah, write your answer and unpause the video when you're ready to see it. So hopefully you guys understood that the point of view can influence a reader's thoughts and opinions on other individuals and events in the text. So you could have gotten this answer from one of the slides that we looked at before we started reading the text. So whoever the author or narrator is, and whatever perspective they're reading it from, it can change the way or impact the way that you think about the event they're talking about. It might make you feel the same way that the author does. It might make you feel angry. It might make you feel it might make you agree with the situation, depending on who the author and what their point of view is. So here's the next question: true or false? The narrator's point of view doesn't matter when it comes to informational text. You can trust any source. So just think about it. Can you actually trust anybody? So like, remember, people write texts, they write information, and just think about, can you trust anybody from what they say or what they write? in this instance. So can you trust any source? So true or false? Unpause the video when you think you're ready to hear the answer. So it's false. Although a lot of things are written in as information, depending on who wrote the text and depending on who wrote it, they might not be a credible person. People can misuse real information to present something in a way that might mislead you. So that's just something really important to think about. Just because it's an informational text, like if it's an article, or just because you found a source where someone was actually there and they're speaking about it, you have to check their credentials. You have to check if they're a good source to learn from. Can't trust anything, so you have to do a little bit more research as to how to do that. But yeah. And the next one is true or false. Informational text can only be written in third person objective. So here, I hope you guys remember that although we did read something in third person objective, we talked about other types of sources or other ways that people can write something in. So just think about those, and do those fit into an informational text setting? Or so yeah. Pause the video to think about it. Unpause to see the answer. So the answer to that is false. You can find an informational text that was written in first person limited. So if you've heard about Anne Frank, so the Diary of Anne Frank, it was about a Jewish girl during the Holocaust, and how she and her family hid from the Nazis. Her diary is all about her own experiences, and she's writing in first person, and she's writing about her own thoughts and feelings. And that's totally informational. She was actually there, and she's telling you about what was happening through her own perspective, through her own point of view. So yeah, you can find informational text that isn't third person objective. It can be first person limited. Yeah. So for listening to this lesson and sticking it out through the whole thing. I hope you guys learned something from this. And just remember to look back at the learning guide to get more practice on point of view in informational text. And we'll see you in the next one. Have a good day.